Welcome to the next episode of Great War Story. I've got a fun one for you this time. Lots of interesting little anecdotes and funny stories. And I've called it The Kiwis and the Yanks in France 1918, where the two countries met up. Now, the first major source I've used for this episode is Charles Croft Marsack, and his book, well, it's not really even a book, you'll see in a moment, is called Diary of a Dink. And this is a photo, actually, of three Marsack brothers when they served in World War II. I think he rose, in fact, to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, but he wasn't at such high ranks in World War I. And you can kind of see there's a bit of a twinkle in his eye that he had an interesting sense of humour, and it really comes through in his writing. And we have this thanks to the New Zealand National Library, the Alexander Turnbull Library, and that's what it looks like on the left. As I said, it's not really a book, it's just a private memo that has been saved by the library, and you can read the whole thing online. I believe, in fact, there's even a volume 2 about his World War II experiences, which I have not yet read. So who was Charles Marsack? Well, when we know him, he's a quartermaster. But he started World War I as a private in April of 1915. He was a sergeant by the end of the year, had risen to become an officer by August of 1916, and then finally he was promoted to be quartermaster for the 3rd Battalion New Zealand Rifle Brigade in November of 1917. And as I said already, through World War II, he was always a quartermaster logistics. He didn't go into combat in World War II, but a captain, then a major, and finally a lieutenant colonel by the end. Now, why is his thing called Diary of a Dink? Well, here is the definition as provided by the official history of the New Zealand Rifle Brigade. With the idea of conveying the impression that the riflemen were inordinately proud of themselves, the term the Square Dinkums was in derision applied to the 2nd Battalion and afterwards, when the other units arrived, to the whole brigade. We were a little sensitive about the nickname when first saddled with it, but in course of time came to look upon it as something to be proud of, realizing that it was used less and less as an expression of scorn, till at last it became a term of genuine esteem. Shortened to the Dinkums, and again to the Dinks, it was an appellation fully recognized within and without the brigade, becoming eventually almost official. Now, before we move on, because we're going to be talking quite a lot about the New Zealanders and the Americans, just want to show you why people in France and elsewhere often mistook the Americans for either Australians or New Zealanders or vice versa. You can see there are Americans on the left, there are some New Zealanders on the right. Now, the AEF is the American Expeditionary Force, not to be confused with the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force, and, well, the New Zealand Expeditionary Forces, NZEF. The main thing to look for, in fact, to distinguish them, is what's around, what kind of band do they have around their hat. The New Zealanders have these things called puggarees, and in fact, the colours of these puggarees, these bands that go around the hat, is a strong indication of what kind of regiment they belong to. And for example, when my grandfather first went to war, he was in the Army Service Corps, so his puggaree would have looked like this. It was khaki with a white band in the middle. I think the cavalry had like a green band in the middle. The infantry had a red band. Now, really annoying, and this has been bugging me a lot, I can't work out what was the colour scheme of the puggarees of the New Zealand machine gunners that Grandad was in 1917-1918. Now, black and white photos aren't very useful. I found this nice, clear black and white photo of a New Zealand machine gunner, and you can see the contrast, at least, is opposite to the ASC puggaree. It's a dark colour in the middle with a lighter colour on the outside, and I've looked, and as yet I haven't found it. Hopefully I'll be able to answer that, and if anybody watching this knows the answer, please let me know in the comments. So, let's hear some of the entries from Diary of a Dink. The first one is from April of 1918. I should say, while primarily this episode's about the New Zealanders and the Americans, I came across a few references to New Zealand encounters with other nationalities, and I threw them in as a bit of a bonus. In Louvencourt and its surrounding district was a concentration of troops belonging to the most bewildering variety of units. Later in April, there was apparently a French corps in reserve in this area, and the estaminets in the village were thronged each evening with English, French, and colonial troops. An estaminet is like a cafe, or perhaps more like a pub or a bar. The Frenchmen in their blue horizon uniforms were a picturesque contrast to our fellows in khaki, and they seemed a fine stamp of men, particularly those with that very attractive headgear, the beret. I should also mention here, for the sake of the Americans, that everybody in the English-speaking world, I think except for Americans, pronounce this word khaki. I've noticed ever since I came to America that Americans call it khaki. Now, I don't know why. I suspect the word comes from British India, and when it first arrived in America, I think they probably just saw it spelled out, and it looks like khaki. So everybody in the United States pronounces that word khaki. Everybody else pronounces it khaki, just so you know what I'm talking about. Fraternization between colonials and Tommies was uncommon, the Tommies being Englishmen. They did not mix easily. With the French it was different. Despite a total ignorance of each other's languages, they seemed to take the greatest delight in each other's company. When the troops were turned out of the estaminets at 8 o'clock in the evening, great lines of Frenchmen and New Zealanders, linked arm in arm, sang their merry way along the cobbled streets, which echoed to the shouts of laughter and general hilarity. The Tommies, on the other hand, were much more restrained and kept to themselves. The Scotties were more congenial, and whenever we met them, relations were of the friendliest. The 51st Division was a particular favourite and inspired in us the greatest confidence. And on the right you can see some Scottish troops and some French troops. And I found this beautiful picture on the New Zealand National Army Museum of New Zealand. It's a YMCA in London, and you can clearly see there's Scotsmen, there's Australians, there's New Zealanders, and perhaps some other nationalities all hanging around having a good time together, which very much matches the entry from Diary of a Dink. Our most relentless enemy in Louvencourt was the area commandant. The unexpected billeting of so many troops within his jurisdiction had driven this irascible old dugout into a state of violent exasperation. By dugout, I mean a retired regular whose blood had grown hot with the urge of getting into uniform again, and who had been furnished by the War Office with a comfortable appointment where he could do no harm. He objected to all line troops, but colonials he loathed with an exceeding great loathing. I had parked the postal people who were attached to me in a roomy barn in the village where they could sort their mails under shelter. The area comedian found them there and furiously ejected them. I applied to him officially for a billet for them, but after having 5 minutes of vituperation spilt over me, I concluded he was not bursting with eagerness to give me one. The postals living very happily in the second story of the same barn for about a week before he found them. They had been foolish enough to forget to draw up the ladder after them. For a while the fun was fast and furious as they moved from place to place. On average, they managed to keep a new billet about 2 days before old Nemesis nosed them out and tossed them into the roadway. At last, the corporal hit on the happy idea of commandeering a well-built shed at the back of the commandant's own billet. As the gentleman always used the front entrance, the post office dwelt in perfect security and sorted its mails practically on his back doorstep. While the fight was on, he wrote long letters of complaint to Corps Daily, and for weeks after we left Louvencourt, I was kept please explaining the use of unauthorized billets. Yes, I think every society and organization attracts these petty little Hitlers, and sad to say, they often acquire these levels of power and use it to make lives miserable for no good reason. And then later they were at Marieux. We stopped and watched a French battalion march by. Their transport to English eyes looked more like a parade of gypsies on the move than a military unit. There were pots and pans, sacks and tarpaulins, and all manner of odds and ends hanging from the shafts and sides of the carts, the tailboards, and in fact everything to which an article could be hung. The contrast with our spick-and-span limbers was astonishing and laughable, but I doubt ours was any more efficient. In fact, I suspect that they were able to trundle along a lot more useful things which regulations would have prevented us from carrying. And then, well, in this case he's contrasting French birds with New Zealand birds, but it's still sort of a national comparison, shall we say. Just near our lines stood the chateau, in pleasant grounds shaded by many beautiful trees. Here at night we used to listen to the Nightingales, the only place in France where I heard them in any numbers. When people speak here of the lovely song of the Tuis, that's a native New Zealand bird up on the top right, when people here speak of the lovely song of the Tuis, I think of the noise like the soaring of knotty wood made by the Tuis who visits my house each spring, and then try to recall the exquisite melody which poured out from the trees about the chateau when the nightingales were singing. Well, the Tuis certainly look nicer, but, well, if you ask Marsack, he preferred the French nightingale. Personally, I think the Tuis are quite nice. If you go to the Wikipedia page for either of these birds, you can actually play the sound of their call, which I thought was a nifty feature. And then there's a story which has nothing to do with them, but I thought it was hilarious, so I kept it in. Palestine liquor heist. But the best story of a raid on liquor came from Palestine. I do not know if it is true, but it was common talk, and most people who told it claimed reliable authority for it. During Allenby's advance, the territory taken included the vast cellars of a world-renowned firm of wine merchants. The New Zealand mounted rifles were camped within a mile or two, but the cellars were protected by a Tommy guard of 20 or so under an officer. The following morning, a similar number of New Zealanders, under a senior NCO, very spick and span and in correct guard attire, marched up and started the elaborate ceremonial of changing guard. The Tommies followed suit. The officer handed over to the NCO in charge of the new party, and after a mutual interchange of compliments, the old guard marched off. When the English officer duly reported, the story goes, his commanding officer expressed surprise, as he had received no instructions that the guard was to be relieved. Inquiries were set on foot, and an hour or so later it was ascertained definitely that no official relief had been sent. A party rode over post-haste, but on arrival at the cellars found no trace of the colonials. The story further says that the secret was well kept and the identity of the new guard never discovered. But an examination of the New Zealand mounted rifles' water bottles would have disclosed some astonishing results. Well, that's interactions, I guess, with the New Zealand colonials and the English, and it's interesting because when we get to the Americans, you'll see the Americans kind of had a similar opinion and reaction to the English, but rather got on quite well with the New Zealanders. May 9th, first sign of the Americans. Then came a practical demonstration of the approaching arrival of the Americans. On the 9th May, an American captain named Johnson was sent along to me for instruction, please. I was ordered to explain to him in detail the British system of feeding and clothing the troops in the line. His visit was amusing and a little disconcerting. I delivered a narration lasting about 20 minutes. Then Johnson talked for about 3 hours without stopping, after which he borrowed my horse Bridget and rode off at a full gallop. Tricklebank, my groom, followed as fast as he could, but it was some considerable time before he found the mare, covered with dried sweat, tethered to a post outside Divisional HQ in Bus. After waiting a while, he went in and inquired for Captain Johnson, but was informed that he had left some time before for an unknown destination. So very disgustedly, Trick led Bridget back to the lines. And there's an interesting quote in this. The Tommy officers let the men go phut. Yes, phut, P-H-U-T. My diary for the 7th of June has a little moan. Another busy day. Took over from the 1/5 Manchesters, and the camp was in a dreadful state. Accommodation very limited, nothing in the way of stores. Yet there is an officers' mess that would do credit to a base camp. That's the Tommies all over. The officers lead a luxurious life and let the men go phut. Marsack continues, this time at Coigneux in July of 1918. One interesting feature of the war on this front was the arrival of some American troops, 2 platoons of which were attached to each battalion in line for trench experience. High-spirited, loquacious fellows they were, much noisier than our own men, greatly given to telling us what they were going to do to the Hun. It did not seem to occur to them that our years of experience had taught us anything but how to make mistakes. They had courage and keenness, certainly more of this latter commodity than we had, but they could not realize that anything else was necessary. In the line they were cheerful companions, and they kept things moving. When they first arrived, I saw their supply officer and said I could arrange for their rations if he would let me have a daily certificate of their ration strength, but he waved my offer aside with hardly a word of thanks, and impressed upon me that American organisation in that department had no superior or even rival in the Allied armies. Pay careful attention to the expressions of the men in this photo before we move on. To be on the safe side, I indented the first day for the necessary additional rations, but kept them at the stores. Late that night came an appealing chit from the adjutant. Could I possibly find rations for the Yanks, as there had been a hitch in their arrangements? A disgusted driver had to turn out and make a second trip to the line with a limber load of stores, and he curses Yankee inefficiency all the way there and back. The following day I risked it, and obtained rations only for my own battalion. Once again there came a chit from the adjutant that a number of our American allies would starve unless I found food for them. This time it was my turn to curse. I had to get Bridget out and ride over to supply, where the supply officer displayed far less concern as to the discomfort of our gallant allies than as to his own in being roused out in an hour when all supply officers were entitled to sleep. However, he gave me the rations, and they were duly delivered to the line. A few hours later, I interviewed a rather crestfallen American officer and arranged with him a system which obviated any further danger of nocturnal foragings. The line was fairly quiet while our Americans were in, and they doubtless concluded that the dangers and perils of war had been greatly overstated. Next we go to a book I've quoted before in previous episodes, with the machine gunners in France and Palestine. By this time, the American army was almost ready to take its place alongside the armies of France and Britain, but before it did so, its officers and men were given a final period of training with various British and French units in the line. Towards the end of July 1918, 5 officers and 114 other ranks from the 313th and 317th US Machine Gun Battalions joined the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion for instruction, and on 4th of August the whole of the 313th Battalion became attached to our New Zealand Battalion. Otago Company, less one section, was withdrawn from the right subsector so that each of the American companies could have a 3 days tour of duty in the forward defences. The American company was smaller than the British, only comprising 12 guns and 160 officers and men. New Zealand Company would have 16 heavy Vickers machine guns. The American gunners adapted themselves to their new and trying duties in a most remarkable way, and soon established a warm friendship with our men. Now I was curious, because this is an official publication. Were they exaggerating how well the men got on together? Well, it turns out they weren't. They really did get on very well. Now we turn to the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion War Diary. July 30th. The attached Americans showed great interest in all our work, and all ranks assisted us in carrying out our duties. And that day I checked out what the War Diary had to say about what the New Zealand machine gunners were doing, and I placed them on the map where the different machine gun teams were placed, and it gave the coordinates of where they were shooting indirect rounds over a couple of thousand yards at German positions, and I placed it on the map for you there. It's near Louvencourt, if you look on the map at the top. So that's what the Americans were helping with. Then August the 4th, War Diary. The US personnel carried out their duties with the same keenness as our own troops. Now, I assume that's meant as a compliment, but interestingly, if you look at Diary for Dink, he said the Americans were more keen than the New Zealanders. So, does he mean the New Zealanders were very keen and the Americans matched them? Or does he... I don't know. I think it's meant as a compliment, but depending how you read it, you could take that as a somewhat ambiguous statement. Now, what was really interesting for me? So, I'd been obsessing for quite a long time about my New Zealand grandfather and his service in World War I, Army Service Corps and then New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion. And to my astonishment, I discovered that there was this other guy, Andrew Capitz, who was my American equivalent. He had been obsessing about his grandfather, who had been in World War I, in that American machine gun battalion. And by sheer coincidence, it was the machine gun battalion that was attached to the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion in 1918. What wonderful coincidence. This is Andrew here. I've never met him in person, but I've corresponded with him via Facebook. I found him on Facebook, and we've swapped a few emails back and forth, and he's a very nice guy. So so that was really quite amazing, and I got some things from his book that I was really rather surprised about, I have to say, and I will give full credit here that all of the quotes that I'm going to make from now on that come from Americans, I took from Andrew's book. And this photo, by the way, that is Kansas City, Missouri, and he's standing up on top of the American World War I Museum. It's a very good museum, I have to say. I was fortunate enough to go visit it, and surprisingly good. In fact, I only went to Kansas City, Missouri for work, in fact. I had no particular desire to go there. I thought, oh, God, what's even there? But I went along. In fact, I stayed in the hotel that you can see just behind Andrew's shoulder, his left shoulder. But I went for a walk around, and I actually really liked Kansas City, Missouri. It had several really good museums, a free streetcar you could ride up to downtown, and yeah, it was a really nice place. Okay, moving on. Oh yes, and before I go on, I want to give him full promotion. You can also go and check out a website that Andrew has set up about his book and his research into the 313th Machine Gun Battalion. So goodwargreatmen.com/313/index.php, and well, if that interests you and you're interested in the American experience in World War I, you should check out his book. I think it's only $16 or $17 on Amazon, and check out his website as well. So this is one of his people that he researched, Captain William George Thomas, who had been a ROTC, was it Reserve Officer Training Corps candidate in 1917. This is what he had to say. All of our battalion, the men, seem to think that all that is necessary is for us to get up to the front, and church will be out. They have a hard road to travel first, I think, but where we get a little experience, we are going to have a wonderful army. So, in that sense, it's interesting because he kind of agrees with what Marsack wrote in Diary of a Dink, that even the Americans' own captain was saying, yeah, I think the men are a bit too overconfident. They're going to have to gain a bit more experience. But so they've got the keenness, but perhaps they're a little bit overconfident. So, which is really rather interesting, because some of the accounts from the other side make it look like, oh, the Americans don't know what they're doing, they have no sense of what they're getting into. But it's very clear that that was not the case as far as Captain Thomas was concerned. He was quite realistic about what was going on. Oh yeah, and I found this photo, the National Army Museum of New Zealand. It's somewhere in England, don't ask me where, and you can see there's a whole bunch of Americans in England, and, you know, a couple of American flags, and, you know, lots of civilians hanging around for quite a nice posed photo. And then I've quoted before Brigadier General Herbert Hart in at least a couple of episodes before, and his book, The Devil's Own War, and this is what he wrote on July the 4th. July the 4th, America's Day, announced today that 1 million American troops have sailed for France, with only the loss of one ship and 249 lives through submarines. 250,000 came over during the month of June. May they continue at the same rate until the figure stands at 4 millions. Then Germany will, Kamerad. What does he mean by that? Well, when the German troops would surrender, they go, Kamerad, Kamerad, don't shoot, don't shoot. So, friend, friend, don't shoot. So, in other words, the Germans will roll over and surrender once all these Americans turn up. So, yeah, some of the people might say mean things about the Americans, but Herbert Hart was, well, very, very happy to see them arriving. Oh yeah, and there's a photo of Herbert Hart I stumbled upon on the National Army Museum of New Zealand. Tall fellow. And then we have another American from Andrew's book. This one is Captain John Kane. Looks like it's pronounced Kean, but it's pronounced Kane. Captain John Kane. He was a 28-year-old Harvard graduate and in charge of C Company of the 330th Machine Gunners. One of our bulletins the other day contained an extract from a German intelligence report on one of our divisions. It was not complimentary and very true, saying that the men had a naive confidence and had not yet lost their nerve and had the big brother attitude. So once again, you have, well, I guess both sides of the same coin. The admission from the Americans that, yeah, maybe their men are a bit too overconfident and, gung-ho and all the rest. And, they're quite realistic about who and what they are. I think in a little while, when Uncle Sam gets a few more divisions broken in, the Hun will really regret it, for until the men get sick of the war and still have their eagerness, nothing in the world at present can lick or stop them, to my way of thinking, and I completely agree with them. I think perhaps that's what they needed, not just the American numbers, but the American keenness and eagerness. Perhaps the other troops had got a little bit too overcautious after, well, who can blame them after so many years of war? And here's a couple of photos I found on that Good War Great Men website. It is John Kean Jr. showing the uniform worn by his father, Captain John Kean, or Kane, I should say, to Andrew Capets, grandson of Andrew A. Capets. So there they are. Two equivalents of me, I guess, people who are very interested in their family's World War I history, but in this case, they have American World War I history. Now, Marsack, while he was on leave in Paris. Watching the crowd surging along the Grand Boulevards had, however, lost something of its charm. This crowd was no longer Parisian, with a small admixture of uniformed foreigners. It appeared now almost exclusively American. I have no idea as to how many American troops there were in July 1918 in the line, but if their numbers on the Paris front were in anything like the same proportion as in the English or French armies, there must have been many millions. Now, I think one day I might come back and make a short episode about this photo and the building in the background. And I was really puzzling because it's a spectacular building, and I was thinking, I'd like to go and see that. I wonder what European city it's in. And you can tell from the context of the quote given that, yes, it was in Paris. Sadly, that building doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished. It wasn't wartime damage, it was just demolished and something far more ugly rebuilt in its place. So I might make a short episode one day about this building and the thing that they replaced it with. I would call it Soviet modern concrete as the replacement, but that's for another day. They filled the hotels, the bars, the theatres. Paris was becoming, as Mencken puts it, the second city of America. Elle and I were, to our disgust, frequently mistaken for Americans, notwithstanding the red puggarees which encircled our slouch hats. Remember I said that's the thing to look for to differentiate the Americans from Australians or New Zealanders? And then another quote, this time Joseph Paul Devir, War History of the 313th Machine Gun Battalion, Company A. The area in question, Louvencourt, many New Zealand machine guns are located around the company. This is where our fellows got hip to some trench warfare stuff. To A Company men, the soldiers from England's colony, New Zealand, measured up to the finest of manhood, and it can be said that these men acted like brothers to us Yankees. When A Company was to return from the trenches, they regretted to leave the New Zealand soldiers. As I said already, I did wonder when I first read in that book with the machine gunners in France and Palestine, when they were saying, oh yes, we got on terribly well with the Americans, it was all good, if that was just the official story and not so true. But actually it turns out all the accounts are glowing. The New Zealanders like the Americans like the New Zealanders, they got on really well. And now we turn to another American from Andrew's book, Lieutenant Minard Hamilton. August 15th. I spent the morning riding around on a horse, trying to locate my men's rations. After great trouble and delay and worry, I found that they had been lumped with the rations of another company, and they almost got double, and we almost went shy. Their sergeant tried to tell us that their quantities were just right for one company, his company, but he jolly well lied. I got back to camp late in the morning, and there received orders to make the relief as before. I assembled the company and told them a few truths about the New Zealanders, gave them my blessing, and left them to follow me in. So first off, the story we had from Marsack about the logistics troubles in the US Army seemed to be reinforced by Hamilton's story, but that second paragraph intrigues me. There's no further context. What exactly were the truths that he told his men about the New Zealanders? I would love to know. Was it complimentary? Was it a warning? You be careful of those guys. They're trouble. Or what exactly did he have to say? I really wish there was more context to explain what he said. Carrying on with Hamilton. August 20th. Yesterday I went out on an awfully funny party. Two of us had to meet up to reconnoitre a back area line of defence. Trenches and wire already put in, and we were to sight in 9 machine gun positions. P censored. This is a letter home, so the guy's name got censored. What a stupid thing to censor, but whatever. I'm just going to call him P from now on rather than saying P censored. P and I started off early in the morning without horses and orderlies to ride to blank, some place that's been blocked out, where we were to pick up the New Zealanders who were going with us. We arrived at our destination after 10 miles to find our New Zealand officers in a bit of a wood, a jolly fine lot. Excellent lunch with a white tablecloth and butter. Cold beef or cottage pie, sir. After lunch, we went out with Colonel to make the reconnaissance, and the Colonel, whose name was censored, was the Colonel of the New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion, Colonel Duncan Blair, and that's him over on the right with a copy of his signature. The Colonel has one blank cracked leg, so bad he has to drag it, and he jolly well ought to be back in New Zealand instead of commanding combat troops. He does famously, however, sort of skipping on one leg and dragging the other, and I had blank to keep up. Honestly, the description Hamilton gives of Blair makes me think of Monty Python. So you've got this fire-breathing New Zealand officer, and he can barely walk, but he's refusing to leave the line, so he's hopping around on one leg, dragging the other one behind him, and you just wait for the rest of the story. It gets better. We did not go on foot, of course, and the Colonel, on account of his leg, has made a practice of riding a horse where an ordinary man would walk cautiously, and you must have a good horse and a dash good seat to stay with him. I had a cart horse not made for riding at all. He was game to the last and galloped until his eyes bulged out of his head. So yes, you read that right. Colonel Blair, my grandfather's commanding officer, had a bad leg and rode his horse around the frontline positions. Well, I'm sure not right at the front line because he wouldn't have lasted very long, but as Hamilton says, he rode his horse where other men would walk cautiously. And I had to learn more about Blair. And at the front of with the machine gunners in France and Palestine, there's another nice photo of him. And, well, what do we know about his backstory? He had fought in the South African War. He was actually a mounted scout and got into some quite precarious situations against the Boers. In 1914, he was a captain with the Canterbury Mounted Rifles, so yes, he was a horseman deep down. He was wounded more than once, in fact, at Gallipoli, but reinforcing what Hamilton's told us, his military file notes he was wounded but remained on duty. Later it says he was suffering from shock, and then notes still at duty. He was not going to get back on a ship. He was going to stay there no matter how much he was suffering. Eventually he was forced to leave and was admitted to hospital, and then in France later in 1916 he gets wounded again, and once more his military file says remained on duty. So this guy was, well, perhaps fire breather's not quite the right term, but he's certainly feels the weight of his duty very strongly, shall we say. And then he was mentioned in Despatches multiple times. This particular one was a write-up when he was awarded his second DSO. For conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty during an action, he repeatedly went through the enemy barrage, steadying and encouraging his men and directing the consolidation of the captured position. His courage and coolness did much to inspire all ranks, and the success of the operation was largely due to his personal efforts, and that was a reward for his actions in November of 1917. And then, well, I had to find more about him. So he actually ended up living in the south coast of France when World War II broke out, and decided, when many other British living in France decided to evacuate, that he'd stay on, and when things got rather sticky he had to get out fairly fast with his family, and so they managed to get out across the Spanish border and then went across to Portugal, where they got a passenger ship all the way down to Argentina, because his wife had family there, and they had arranged to pay for a ticket for them to go down, and in fact that's where he lived for the rest of his life. Now I have to do a big shout out here to Pamela. I just exchanged an email with her today, and I don't know her last name, but she was very generous in pointing me out to more details about her, her great uncle. And this is what she wrote. Duncan was my grandmother's brother and ended up settling in Argentina with his family and lived to age 97 doing his memoirs later in life. My second cousin, his grandson, sent me the memoirs a while ago, but they were in Spanish, so I had to translate them on my computer. Marieux, my cousin, has since had them translated properly and sent me a copy of them redone in English, which is much better read than my computer-translated one. And she directed me to something that she had posted online. She's done a great community service for people interested in researching World War I, because under the entry, Genai is one of these, websites where you build family trees and you can get DNA tests to help you do it, that kind of stuff. And under the entry for her great uncle, grandmother's brother would be great uncle, yes. She actually has posted a whole long set of information, which is the translation of her cousin's, the document that her cousin sent her. And the next few things come from that document. So Duncan Blair memoir. And he talked, and I wanted to get some more of his backstory. How did he get wounded in Gallipoli? How did he end up with a game leg, for example? So Gallipoli in 1915. The Murray Battalion I commanded in one of the counterattacks gained territory. I was taken down by a bullet, however. It entered my heel and penetrated my Achilles tendon, paralyzing my leg. I soon made it back to my feet to lead my troops. As I said, this guy... I know that there's a Sabaton song about the unkillable soldier, but I think this guy's practically the New Zealand equivalent. I got shot through my Achilles tendon, but that didn't stop me. I was mildly wounded in the forehead and the back of my left hand by a piece of rock or bullet, but neither lesion caused much trouble. Today, I have only faint scars. In the heat of battle, like in rugby matches, slight wounds merit hardly any attention. In any case, all of this was child's play compared to the tragedies ensuing elsewhere. And then later in Gallipoli, I was among those wounded in the attempt to reach that position. In the trench, an enemy grenade exploded just a few feet from me. 3 were killed and 3 others wounded. My sergeant and myself were completely covered in debris. The mighty explosion burned parts of my body and left me mute. It was after that he eventually agreed to be evacuated. And then later in France, he talks about, the Americans. Groups of North American artillerymen were sent over for instruction in our methods. They are a good sort of man. On July 14th, while inspecting the positions on the front with Major Parks, my second-in-command, I was wounded in the thigh while dodging a bullet. Because of the sound of the explosion and the pain upon contact, I thought I had lost my leg when I fell to the ground in shock. Despite how much it hurt when I moved, my leg was only wounded. Oh, only wounded. Now, this is not a photo of Blair. I looked to find a suitable photo. Kind of hard to find a photo to match it. This is from the New Zealand National Army Museum, and I settled just for a New Zealand officer with a walking stick. Well, that was the best I could do. Parks requested a stretcher, and we returned to our horses, and from there to headquarters. The doctor found that my leg was not broken, but I needed a few days' bed rest. Though I had to use a cane because of my stiff leg, I returned to duty. The record showed that I was wounded but on duty, and under the care of the battalions to avoid alarming my wife and friends about the seriousness of the incident. So it turns out the reason he was limping and hopping around and dragging one leg wasn't actually because of an old wound from Gallipoli, although he did, in fact, get shot through the Achilles heel. It was actually because just in the middle of July, he had this accident, so it was a much more recent injury. But he said, I don't care if I have to hop and limp and whatever, I'm staying with my battalion. And this was from the cover of a model kit set, which, out of interest, was made in Ukraine, of all places. But okay, let's carry on with Blair. In August and part of September 1918, a company of North American machine gunners was attached. I think he meant to say attached, but it actually does say attack. That's not a typo on my part. Was attacked while under my command. I was sad to lose them when they were called to duty for their own division. The North Americans were an excellent and friendly sort of fellow in work and in battle. When a general advance got underway, it was difficult to set them apart from the attack of our infantry, which, thanks to its persistence, was able to gain ground and capture a great many enemies. So in this case, you can see that Blair's got a high opinion of his New Zealand troops, who the Germans also, by the way, rated quite highly as aggressive and dangerous soldiers. And he rated the Americans as every bit as good as the Kiwis. Now back to Hamilton's account. So we started, the colonel, several majors, and I was outranked horribly by everyone, and myself. The colonel riding first would half turn in his saddle, hold up one finger, then dig in his spurs and over the hills and far away, before you could say Jack Robinson. It had been pouring and had been rough going. "This is madness," said one of the New Zealanders through his teeth. "The colonel ought not to be allowed out. We can't keep this up." But we did. I felt as if I were riding to the hounds, and the list of the chase came over me. Mind you, this was a reconnaissance, and we were supposed to get a good view of the country. I didn't see much all afternoon, but the ears of my horse and the stream of mud sent up by the horse ahead. Through the barbed wire, over ditches, uphill, down dale, and always, whenever we tried to slow up, the old bird of a colonel would turn in his saddle and hold up that one finger before disappearing in a cloud of mud. He would jump right down into a trench and ride his horse along the firing step, where it is all a man could do to walk. "No dugouts here," he would call, and we thank God, for I have no doubt that if there had been one, he would have held up his one finger and gone clattering down into it. And this was a photo from the New Zealanders in Egypt doing a steeplechase, but when I saw it, it kind of reminded me of Colonel Blair. We were riding through a wheat field full tilt when P, tearing along behind us, was suddenly swallowed up by the wheat. Two of us galloped back and found that he had charged head-on into barbed wire. The horse had turned a complete somersault, throwing both quite clear, but had then sat firmly upon P until asked to desist. They were an awful mess, the horse badly cut about the forelegs, and P not a little shaken up. And this is another photo I found, quite an amazing photo, frankly, from the New Zealand National Army Museum, of a horse that stumbled during a steeplechase, one of these performances while they were in Egypt. And the caption actually noted that the horse and rider were relatively okay after the fall. And I thought it matched the story of Colonel Blair and poor American P, whatever his name was, going somersaulting over and having his horse sit in him. As the colonel had by this time entirely disappeared into the mist of the horizon, the only thing for us to do was to plod our weary way homeward. We did finally arrive at the New Zealand camp, and after a cup of tea felt better. The colonel came hobbling in after a good while and insisted on our staying to dinner, as our horses could not be ridden another step. The old sport sent us flying back in a staff car like two belly generals. Now, I've mentioned before in some episodes that I'd love to have a TV series perhaps about my grandfather's life, make different episodes. And some of the stuff you would think was so exaggerated it couldn't possibly be real. Sounds like something, Blackadder Goes Forth or Monty Python. To have a commanding officer like Colonel Blair, I think it would make great and hilarious TV. And it's all entirely true. You don't have to make up anything. Today I can scarcely walk, and P is in bed. We had a très bon reconnaissance, if you please, and if we ever have to defend that line, we have not only seen the ground, but we have had it in our ears, nose, and mouth. Yes, sirree, we know the ground. Back to the machine gunners. The American battalion commander and his staff received their baptism of fire while making an inspection of the division sector with Lieutenant Colonel Blair. Every portion was visited and many explanations were given. After returning to battalion headquarters, the party summed up their impressions with the words, "most illuminating." I'm sure they had plenty of other words they could have used, given that American's description of what it was like terrifying or stupid or possibly insane or what the hell were you thinking? But most illuminating was probably the politest reply they could come up with. Now, another American, Sgt Charles Earnest Ray. We came under English officers and were attached to a New Zealand Machine Gun Battalion and sent into the Somme near Toulon, where the trenches were 12 to 14 feet deep with a parapet to fire from. There seemed to be only a few people who know the American soldiers were sent into the English front with English equipment and given their rations. The hardtack was so hard it could only be eaten by taking 2 rocks to break it into pieces, then let it dissolve in your mouth. There were times when it tasted good too. I think that's only because he was so hungry. I remember their jam was excellent. We did find the New Zealanders and Australians a group of fine men to soldier with. They were seasoned soldiers and we just rookies. They had probably spent 2 or 3 years in the trenches if they were lucky, as a machine gunner's life was short. Now, the other day in another episode, I said they were called the Suicide Squad, and I kicked myself because it was Suicide Club, not Suicide Squad. Yet, yes, the machine gunners were known as the Suicide Club because, well, who is it that the enemy wants to kill first? Of course it's the men manning machine guns. And then we have another American, Thomas. Oh, no, this is not an American. This is a New Zealander. His diary is also held by the Alexander Turnbull National Library of New Zealand. And sadly, he was killed within about a month of writing these diary entries. The whole thing was in, penciled handwriting and quite hard to read. And he just wrote very brief entries. And frankly, I probably would have left it out, except for the fact that he died. And I feel like I owe it to Thomas Preston to include what he wrote, since it is relevant to my story. So I found every reference he made to the Americans. July 23rd, we have 10 Yanks attached to us. Sector very quiet today. July 24th, some more Yanks have come. July 25th, Otago went over yesterday and got 8 guns and 15 Huns and killed 50 Huns, casualties light. Got relieved by the 4th Battalion Dinks tonight. Remember Diary of a Dink? Rifle Brigade. July 26th, we're getting cleaned up and having a bath. Last night at 7 p.m, Fritz counterattacked and we repelled him, taking 50 prisoners. We have 900 Yanks attached to the brigade. August 2nd, went into reserve support line. Relieved Wellington Infantry Brigade, Rossignol Wood. I am in charge of a section of Yanks. August 6th, nearly all the company shifted out of the line. The Yanks are taking over from us. Rum issued this morning. War news good. Sector very quiet. And just a couple of weeks after that, poor Thomas Preston would die. And I wish that the Alexander Turnbull Library had a bit more information about how his diary came to be in their hands, because, well, it's there now, it's scanned, but it's, and also a typed up transcript would be nice, because they've got a number of diaries scanned, but they're all, well, some of them are pretty rough to read. Then we have Lieutenant Otto Paul Lienhauser. And yes, that absolutely is a German name. He was the son of German immigrants, but he was fiercely patriotic. He was an American. August 4th, the New Zealand officers greeted us right warmly, and after having our lunch, we started for the trenches, arriving there about 5 p.m. Here we had our first experience of shell fire. None of it was close, so we didn't mind that much. Plenty of shells going both ways, but it seems we sent over about 5 to 1. I spent my first night in the trenches in an old German dugout, which was about 50 feet deep and quite safe unless one came in the doorway. Yeah, the Germans dug much deeper dugouts, and in fact, elsewhere in that Diary of a Dink, he discusses the pros and cons, because the deep dugouts tend to mean the men are so sheltered they're very reluctant to come out and not really ready to fight the moment they emerge, while the British tactic of not having these super deep dugouts did expose them to more casualties, but did leave them better prepared to cope with German assaults and so on. August the 5th, the New Zealanders played a good joke on Jerry today. A couple went out of our position about 600 yards to a patch of woods, which is about 500 yards square, started a fire, and then cleared out. So 2 New Zealanders sneak out into the middle of no man's land and start a fire. The Germans, thinking the wood was occupied, started up a terrific shelling, which lasted about an hour. Trees and dirt were flying all over the landscape, but as far as I know, no one was hurt, although about 100 shells fell in the woods. Yes, so that's what passes for pranking the enemy in 1918, I guess. August 6th. I took a walk around the trenches today. I kept on walking, met very few men, and was surprised at how few men were actually required to hold a trench. Now, this is something that it took me a while to learn, that the defensive strategy was not to put stacks of men in your frontline trench. The frontline trench was really only meant as a tripwire, because if they were all there, they were of course exposed to enemy artillery fire. You knew where they were, you'd suffer a lot of casualties. So you had to keep a certain number up there. But in fact, trench warfare was about well, what did they call it? Tactical ambiguity. In the sense, you don't want the enemy to know where you have your troops massed. So you would have a second line of trenches and a third line of trenches, and they'd all be connected by communications trenches. And so if you spotted the Germans coming, you would wait until the artillery barrage was over, and then you'd bring your men up. You never actually wanted the Germans to know. If you just stuck all your men in your front line trench, well, that was just a recipe for letting the enemy inflict mass casualties on you and weakening you ready for an attack. So, in fact, frontline trenches would generally, the very first frontline trench would generally be quite lightly held. Back to Leinhauser. August 7th to 9th. While we were doing this firing of machine guns, the German artillery was also busy. They usually did any time the machine guns started, and they got 5 New Zealanders who were bringing up water on a narrow gauge railroad track. And I found a photo of some guys bringing up artillery shells, but, same difference. And another American, Wallace Ben Holland, known as Ben. August 11th, we have lady bartenders, and there's a kiss that goes with each bottle of wine. I wonder if that's true. They call a soldier over here a digger. Everyone says, hello, digger, and a German is called Jerry. Now, I thought that was very curious, because growing up in New Zealand, and I also lived in Australia for a while, the word digger is a term always used to apply to Australian or New Zealand troops. Like a British soldier or a French soldier, they're not diggers. Americans aren't diggers. And I looked at this and thought, hello. I said there were people confusing the Australians and New Zealanders with the Americans. I think what was going on here was that people saw Ben Holland's hats, and the French around there were used to the Australians and New Zealanders and knew they called themselves digger and were, mistaking him for an Australian or New Zealander. And here's the definition for you, once again turning to the history of the New Zealand Rifle Brigade. The origin of the sobriquet digger is applied to the New Zealand and Australian soldier and is shrouded in mystery. It is known that the men of the Working Battalion, a temporary unit formed of drafts from 3 brigades, occasionally addressed one another as digger when cable-bearing it in March 1917 in preparation for the Messines battle. In our brigade, it became fairly common when we were engaged on similar work for the French army on the northern part of the line in the following July, and during the long month spent on duty of the same nature in the Ypres salient just before Passchendaele, its use became fully established. It is probably safe to say that the Australians were the inventors of the term as a form of address or salutation. So yes, Australian troops or New Zealand troops, you can call them diggers, not American troops. Back to Hamilton. The fog of war hangs over everything and nobody knows the future, but the Yanks are doing fine work below Soissons, and I'm proud of them. I'm afraid they're having rotten casualties, but it is better so as it shows they're really in it. The Germans are better trained and are much nearer their base, but give us a chance and we'll have them by the ears, and by George they know it. A little while and it'll be over. I don't see how they can stand the pressure of another year. Well, he's spot on, of course, they couldn't. These French peasants are pretty discouraging people. They seem so old and worn out and stolid, and you never see any young people or hear anyone laugh. They have borne too much, oh, much too much. August the 24th. The British, or English rather, are all right, but our boys don't like them too much. They don't like the broad A. Now, I think that's pronunciation, and here's something interesting between Australians and New Zealanders. The New Zealanders have the broad A, while the Australians have the flat A, more like the Americans. So a New Zealander goes to a castle to have a chance of a dance, but an Australian goes to a castle to have a chance of a dance. So I think they're referring to something that actually the New Zealanders had too, the broad A. That the American troops don't like the broad A, they don't like the English tobacco, and most of all, they don't like the English ration. It isn't enough for these big Yanks, and nothing else could so militate against brigading us together. We don't like their grub. Anyway, it is all over. Our training period is over. We are now quite fit to go into the line with our own unbeatable army. And then we have a comment I found on the Imperial War Museum website from Sir Alexander Bevell Gibbon Stanier of the Welsh Guards. The Americans were in very good form, and they didn't seem to realize that the Germans were close. They made the most appalling noise, which of course frightened the Germans, who thought they were going to be attacked, I think. They also had a bet on as to who would shoot the first German in this battalion. The Germans sent over a patrol to find out what was happening, and of course they all let fly, and they did shoot the equivalent of a German company sergeant major, who was brought in dead. And of course, then there was the most appalling argument as to who had shot him, because about 1 million rounds had been fired. But they were very keen, and as I say, there were too many of them in a small space. They caused the most frightful commotion, and the Germans kept on thinking they were being attacked. I had a very uncomfortable time, because we had much more shelling while they were there. We kept it all quiet. And I think, doesn't that just beautifully summarise what's going on? Here we have these fresh troops who are keen to get into it, and then you have the old, worn-down troops who, I mean, yes, they've had more experience, but also it's like, we'll just leave you. We leave the enemy alone; they'll leave us alone. You can see the very, very different attitudes of the fresh troops versus the troops who have been there for a long time. And then back to Diary of a Dink. And this one is more of an interaction with the British officer, but still about, different nationalities and how they got on with each other. It appeared that Fritz was retiring. Oh yes, context here. October the 8th, the day that my grandfather got shot through the face and his terrible wound, was the day that the New Zealanders finally broke through the last bastions of the Hindenburg Line, finally had open country in front of them for the very first time. They had finally achieved the breakthrough. And, so carrying on from there. It appeared that Fritz was retiring, and the troops up in front were moving forward cautiously but rapidly in an endeavour to keep in touch with the enemy rear guard. Orders were to find the battalion, wherever it might be. Remember that Marsack is the quartermaster. He's got to bring up the food and the supplies to, keep the men fed. On we went, all ranks greatly excited by the prospect of actually following up a Boche retreat. Our column crossed the beautiful sheet of water which was the canal, moved out through Crevecoeur, the scene of recent fighting, heavy fighting, and made its way along the valley towards Sarenvier. Here, just forward of yesterday's front line, we took our midday halt. For an hour we loafed in the sun on a sunken road, ate our food, and heard spirited witticisms at the other troops who trudged along the cobbles. Shortly after we took to the road again, we saw an English regiment. My recollection is that it was a Guards battalion, but I may well be mistaken. They were advancing over the green fields in artillery formation. Artillery formation is, you're dispersed. You don't want to be, all clustered together, so artillery shells and shrapnel will take you out. So they were going across, thinking the Germans were very close with their troops in a very dispersed formation. They were advancing over the green fields in artillery formation. An officer, probably an adjutant, rode over to me and called me every kind of fool for daring to march my men and horses in column of route within a few hundred yards of the enemy. I thanked him for his consideration, but pointed out that the line troops were a mile or two ahead. "And who, do you suggest, has driven the Boche back 2 or 3 miles? "Our fellows, New Zealanders, and it's more than 2 or 3 miles, probably 7 or 8. "My God, you colonials are devils to skite, aren't you?" "That's so. We're good at most things." Now, of course, think about World War I. You normally measure advances in terms of a few yards, 100 yards or 500 yards advance is a good thing. To be driving the enemy 2 miles, 3 miles, 7 miles, 8 miles is unheard of until this day in World War I. And I had to put a little asterisk there to remind me, because skite to me is an absolutely normal word. It took me years to realize that living in America, that Americans had no idea what this word means. It means boast. So, "My God, you colonials are devils to boast, aren't you?" And Marsack replied, "That's so. We're good at most things." He rode off in a temper, and his battalion continued to advance across country in the orthodox formation, while we pursued our tranquil course in column of route along the road. There was practically no shelling. Occasionally an odd high explosive would send up a pillar of black smoke from the middle of a green paddock, but nothing fell within a few hundred yards of us. And, I have to say how pleased I am to hear how much the Americans and New Zealanders liked each other, because, I've mentioned in previous episodes that I live in California, and this photo, in fact, is a merging of America and New Zealand in a different way. This was my citizenship ceremony where I went to take my oath as an American citizen. And and I particularly timed it because you can see up there was the countries represented today, and you can see on the bottom right there is New Zealand. I don't know if there are any other New Zealanders there, but I was there. I think actually that day 3,000 people were taking their oaths of citizenship. I had a girl from Sri Lanka on one side of me and a girl from Japan on the other side of me. And, well, you can see all those seats are waiting to be filled up. And that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. A little bit less serious, a little bit less bloodthirsty with men getting killed all over the place. I hope you enjoyed it and these funny stories as much as I did. So I'm going to say good evening to you.